it felt like if we kept growing at the pace we were growing, we would be unstoppable.
Welcome to The Craft of Campaigns. I'm your host, Andrew Willis Garces. In this podcast, we go behind the headlines and hashtags, inviting movement storytellers to share lessons from social justice campaigns. Campaigns are a series of collective actions focused on winning a concrete demand beyond one-off mobilizations or election cycles. They have villains and heroes, teams that make plans to win, and activate people on the sidelines. In each episode, we explore one campaign through first-hand interviews for key lessons, principles, and practices for organizers today. To set up today's story, I want to go back to episode 8, when I talked about how much I had learned from watching casino-free Philadelphia refuse to give up despite numerous losses in the courts and the State House. They kept finding new ways to pivot and identify a new target or point of leverage, or a way to bring even more of the public onto their side. But sometimes it doesn't work out like that for our campaigns. Sometimes we've identified that there's only one target we could possibly move that could bring about the real world changes to realize a part of our visions, as with today's episode. And after years of campaigning, they haven't budged, and we don't see another way forward. We either put the campaign on ice into a form of hibernation, or we close up shop. At Training for Change, we regularly get asked to give workshops on escalating campaign tactics, and we're fans of all the resources others have created to turn up on targets. Right now, you can find guides written by the Change Agency, Beautiful Trouble, the Blackout Collective, but there's not too many handouts on how to lose a campaign with grace, or to navigate a moment in the wilderness, besides the documentary of the same name about Martin Luther King Jr.'s incredible and unsuccessful campaign for open housing in Chicago. Given how common it is to lose, or at least fail to reach most of our campaign goals, I was thrilled when West Virginia organizer and TFC trainer Katey Lauer said she was ready to share the story of a significant setback she was part of in the Mountain States movement ecosystem, which seemed eerily reminiscent of what so many of us were going through in 2022. She talked about what she wished that group of campaigning organizations had been able to do in hindsight, to notice how they began to turn on each other, to see despair cast its long shadow over their strategy conversations. And she also described what many of them were now doing 8 years later to avoid many of the same pitfalls. As a little more context for the references Katey makes in this episode, back in 2013, West Virginia organizers and hundreds of activists who relocated temporarily and sometimes permanently from other parts of the country had spent years trying to activate different points of leverage that would make it harder to mine coal and poison the state's rivers and drinking water. Sometimes they targeted the mine operators themselves and tried to stop strip mining by blockading the mines. At other times, they went after state regulatory agencies and pressured them to enforce water protection rules by conducting their own water monitoring, and by catching coal companies breaking rules, making it more expensive for them to operate, which is work that still continues to this day, and by filing lawsuits. And they were especially determined to get the EPA to roll back the Bush administration's policy that basically said the government couldn't regulate coal mining to protect water, but instead that they would slowly consider each proposal for a new coal mine, effectively allowing more and more people to lose access to safe drinking water, not to mention the mountains themselves. 6 years into Obama's term, the organizers had hosted huge marches, mobilizations, and civil disobedience actions across the state and in DC. They were worn out and they wanted so much to be on the cusp of victory. Katey and I recorded this conversation in May 2022 as a pilot episode for what would become the Craft of Campaigns podcast. You may notice our style has changed a bit since then, and there have also been a number of updates from Katey's current organizing, which we'll share about at the end of this episode and in the show notes. In particular, the November midterms marked the conclusion of West Virginia Can't Wait's 2-year season of campaign work. She shared even more reflections since then, which you can read about on The Forge, linked in the show notes. And as always, if you want stories like this one to reach more organizers, you can participate in a collective action on the recommendation algorithm by leaving us a rating and a review in your podcast app. Katey Lauer is an organizer, facilitator, and trainer in West Virginia with a deep love of place. She has formed and led grassroots organizations in the Appalachian Mountains for 15 years as coordinator of the Alliance for Appalachia, lead organizer of Appalachia Rising and the March on Blair Mountain, and founding director of the West Virginia Mine Wars Museum. Architect of the West Virginia Can't Wait movement, Katey currently acts as co-chair of this statewide formation that's out to win a people's government in the Mountain State. And she's a core trainer at Training for Change. Katey Lauer, thank you for being here with us today. You're here to tell us about a campaign or a series of campaigns that you were part of in West Virginia that you feel like is super relevant for us in 2022. But these campaigns took place quite a while ago. I think the last one, the sort of one that feels most relevant to you, took place in 2014, or at least part of it. So can you give us the trailer, if this were a movie, what's the campaign, and what are some of the lessons we're going to hear about for this year?
So there's this mining practice in Central Appalachia called mountaintop removal strip mining, and it's basically a way of mining coal that blasts the top off a mountain and pushes it over the side of the mountain into the valley below. It does all sorts of terrible things. It fills the air with dust and gets people sick. It poisons water, so people are drinking contaminated water. It cracks the foundations of people's homes and rattles trailers. It's just an awful thing to live near. And on top of it, fewer people are employed at those mines. And so it's a way for the coal industry to do some union busting. In the early 2000s and coming into sort of 2007 and 8, there was this movement starting to form to resist strip mining in the region and abolish the practice. And over a series of years, that movement grew in strength and size every single year. And a coalition called the Alliance for Appalachia was working together to run a series of campaigns in coordination to stop the practice. And that's what this story is about. I want to tell a story of a movement that I was a part of over a series of years, gained a ton of momentum, excitement. It felt like we were resisting our worst tendencies and maximizing our best ones. And just, we were so full of hope and had the sense of possibility of winning the thing we were up to fighting for. And I want to tell the story of getting this close to those victories and the conditions changing in a way that it left us really wondering, like, what the heck do we do now? And feeling really lost.
Okay, thank you for that. And so that we'll get to know about you more as the storyteller, can you tell us what your connection is to this campaign and this story?
I'm in my home in Fayette County, West Virginia. I've been organizing here in the mountains for about 15 years. And my connection to this story is that at the time, I was the coordinator of a regional Appalachian coalition called the Alliance for Appalachia, which was a formation of 15 organizations in the region that were working side by side to fight strip mining.
Okay, and can you set the stage for us about this campaign and what led up to it? Who are the main characters in the story, and what were the conditions that led to this part of the campaign in 2014?
So the goal of the Alliance for Appalachia was to end strip mining. These 15 member groups we had were all sorts of organizations. There were lawyers that were affiliated with an organization called Earth Justice. There were nerdy water monitors that would go out and test the water quality underneath sludge dams and dump sites to catch mining companies when they were out of compliance. There were direct actionistas who used tactics like locking down and strip mine. There were big base building groups. So it was a real collection of different kinds of movement organizations. And within the Alliance for Appalachia, we were running a number of campaigns from different angles in coordination with each other to stop strip mining. One of the central campaigns was that we were, after years of operating under the Bush administration, Obama got elected, and we saw this opening to possibly get the EPA to to issue guidance that would stop the practice in its tracks, and had a lot of reason to believe that that was going to happen. And what happened in 2014, after years and years of organizing and building, was that we found out it wasn't going to happen. We found out from the Obama administration that their EPA wasn't going to take action on this issue. And part of why that blow was so significant was that we had also got the Clean Water Protection Act, which was sort of the legislative vehicle for the same end, was also stalled in Congress. Our permitting campaigns were turning out to be less effective. And we'd run these and host these enormous mobilizations in order to protect a couple of particular mine sites, including Blair Mountain, against destruction. And by 2014, what we were starting to realize is that each of these tactics, each of these campaigns that we were trying on as a movement, they were all stalling.
Okay, so sounds like over 6 or 7 years, a few different overlapping organizations were trying to stop strip mining and mountaintop removal mining and the harms it was causing, and that you all rotated between a few different targets and points of leverage, from state agencies that weren't enforcing existing rules to the companies themselves trying to make it more costly for them to mine. And you all were trying to shame the agencies into doing their jobs, or even sometimes, like with water monitoring, just giving them information. And then also using direct actions like blockades to stop the mining and to spotlight it. And lots of people like you moved to the state to be part of this fight. And eventually, once the Obama administration came in, your sense was one of the aims of all of this visibilizing we're doing of the harms of mountaintop removal is actually to get the EPA's new leadership to roll back some of the protections that had been lost under President Bush. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we had in our favor in 2009, 10, 11, 12 is that there were so many different kinds of campaigns being waged simultaneously in the coal fields that there was this sense of like the issue couldn't be ignored. I can't tell you how many journalists would show up in a given week and from all over the country and cover stories of strip mining in these major publications. There was a big 60 Minutes episode about it, a big New York Times episode. And there was just this, I think because there was so much agitation coming from so many fronts, it felt like the administration was going to have to do something about it. And we heard as much when they started to come into office, right? We have members of our coalition that were meeting with top leadership in the EPA that had the ear of the director saying things like, we're going to be able to get meetings, we're going to be able to negotiate. And the chaos that was happening in the coal fields and the amount of press coverage that was going on, and what we heard were a sort of sympathetic notion secondhand from the EPA director made it feel like, yeah, like something's going to move here. We're going to be able to shift, and have created enough noise and chaos that the administration is going to see this as an opportunity to do something about it. Another way of saying that is that we had, I think, mounted a pretty effective inside-outside strategy with our lawyers and sort of like professional class folks working on the inside around the administration, and the rest of us creating a lot of agitation outside of it.
All right, so the direct actions on the outside are supporting the work of advocates on the inside, and you all did that during Obama's first term. The momentum kept ramping up, and then you get to his second term after 2012 and are focusing more and more on pressuring the EPA directly. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. I mean, when I first got involved in 2007, everything was growing. I would go down there in the summers as a part of this organization called Mountain Justice Summer that was full of young people, which would sort of show up in mass in the summers to help run direct action campaigns or do water monitoring work or do community outreach work. And it felt like if we kept growing at the pace we were growing, we would be unstoppable. I remember going to action camps where we'd have 200 people show up and stay for the summer and do work in the region. We had all these campaign houses that people could come and drop in at if there was a reporter or someone who wanted to come and pitch in. There was just this growing web of relationships. It felt magical. It felt like the thing we were up to was magical. When the Obama administration came into power, it felt like that was our opening, that what was going to happen was all of this work, all of this building, something was going to give either in Congress or in the EPA. And so things really, I think all of that like momentum that had been building for so long felt like, great, we're honed. We know what we're doing. We're going to be able to apply that to this new opponent and just kind of fall into our favor, because everything we had heard up to that point in terms of our sort of negotiations with the transition teams and stuff like that inside of the administration gave us reason to believe that there was hope for it. And by 2014, we were a couple years into that inside out strike game. And I think starting to realize this isn't going to happen. Like the hope that we were holding out for, that like in this next set of conditions, we were going to be able to do even more or win the goal of the coalition, the administration wasn't going to move.
And how did that realization settle in?
I don't think a lot of us realized it till after the fact. And I think that's part of why this story feels so relevant to now, is that in many ways, what we tried to do when we felt that resistance was go even harder. That we were getting a lot of signals, we were getting a lot of external signals that like the campaign strategies that we're working aren't going to be effective for this moment. And so what we tried to do was double down. And when that wasn't possible, when we were finding that we just weren't mobilizing as many people, or we were losing the smaller campaigns inside of the larger one, what we started to do was get critical of each other. And so that would look like, there was a period of time where it was like 90% of our time was working really, like just trying to work in a similar direction, and 10% of our time was coalition conflicts. And it felt like that dynamic was shifting to be 20% of our time we're working on trying to move campaign work forward, and 80% of our time we're doing all this like coalition and movement maintenance work, because there was so much conflict and critique and burnout and frustration that was up. And a lot of this culminated in a big, we called it the Visioning Summit. We had this big kind of movement-wide summit in 2014 to, I think in theory, address all these issues that were bubbling up and theoretically work through them. And I think what we didn't realize at the time, or we weren't, I'll say for myself, wasn't in touch with, was that we were actually entering a new era of the work, and us trying to like force it or make each other show up in a particular way was actually counterproductive to our long-term ends.
And you said forcing each other to show up. Is there an example of what that forcing each other to show up look like you could share with us?
I mean, I think before, when we were just in this period of incredible momentum, there was a sense that we needed all these tactics and all these strategies because they were feeding, I think in our best imagination, in our most abundant version of that time, we could see the ways in which these tactics and the approaches and campaigns that we're utilizing as movement all fit together, were helping us get bigger. When we started to fail, we then got really critical of each other. So that could look like, why wasn't I included in this thing? Or we would be winning if only these certain people were at the table, or your tactic is the reason my tactic isn't working, but otherwise it would. And instead of focusing on what are the conditions around us and what does that mean, or instead of focusing on our grief, frankly, about the fact that we were so stuck, we treated each other as our problem instead of doing the internal work or the external seeing of what was going on. And the repercussions of that were, one, we just spent a couple of years being really mad at each other and really stressed out and strained and hurting a lot. We spent a lot of time hurting each other. We also, I don't think we're able to use our resources wisely, because we were still trying to push something forward that wasn't available out of, I think, a sense of desperation. We were so clenched at that time, trying to make a thing happen that wasn't available. And I don't think we got much wiser for it. I think the way that we were relating to the moment, we were not growing in our capacity to do things like weather transitions or grieve well as a group or individually, or do effective diagnosis of the landscape we were in. And so I think what we did instead was sort of chewed each other up and got smaller. And I think the thing I want to say here that feels important, Andrew, is not that I think if we had done that kind of like that grieving work and that landscape assessment work, like suddenly we would have stopped mountaintop removal. Like that, the thing is, it wasn't available at that moment. But I think what we would have done is had more people stay in the network and know themselves better and get better at weathering the inevitable transitions that do come in movement cycles. And that feels like the opportunity that was lost.
Okay. And so you gave us a lot of foreshadowing just now, a lot of teasers for why this feels relevant, this story for today in 2022. So can you take us there? What reminders to grieve do you wish we'd had room for back then? Or how does this feel like 2022 in West Virginia? How have we seen this movie before, do you think, Katey?
I think that everything about that story feels relevant to 2022. To speak about our own work, I think the conditions are getting harder for us to win these sort of up-down fights in our electoral work in West Virginia right now because our opponents are so well organized that the bench building work we're hoping to do, we know it's going to take a long time, and it sure feels like it. It sure feels like we have to sort of grind through this cycle to get to the next one, and we might not have a big sexy victory to show in 6 months, despite doing a lot of work to try to grow our bench. I also feel it in our organization wasn't working directly to pressure Joe Manchin, but I'm just thinking of the hundreds of organizations inside of West Virginia and beyond that were feeling like, okay, there's this opening at the federal level to move some of our work forward, and watching him over and over again side with corporate interest over working people. And I think there's a lot of folks that in national organizations and local organizations that were hoping for some kind of big breakthrough that now it just seems like it's probably not going to come. I know a lot of organizations, including ours, that were just building and building and building in the lead up to the 2020 election and are no longer in a mobilization moment and are wondering, what the heck do we do with ourselves? And so I see a lot of this turning inward in the worst sense of that phrase around me, which is that a lot of organizers sort of not feeling like it's very possible to manifest power, against our opponents right now, are sort of manifesting it against each other, and we're tearing each other up.
Yeah, that definitely is a phenomenon we've been experiencing here in North Carolina, and I've watched organizers struggling in similar terrain in other places too. It's not just West Virginia. But you told me you all have been trying to handle it a little differently this year than you did in 2014. What are you at your new organization trying out?
Yeah, I'm a part of a statewide organization called West Virginia Can't Wait that we say we're out to win a people's government in West Virginia. So that means that we run candidates for office who sign on to our no corporate cash pledge and platform. And we do a lot of other support for folks that are stepping in where government is failing in the state, whether that's folks that are doing workplace organizing or organizing for land access or to support the development of Black youth. We support folks that are building the pieces of infrastructure our state needs to thrive. One way it's showing up for us right now that I'll say I'm trying to take the wisdom from 2014 and apply it to now is that we are, instead of pushing forward as hard as we can and trying to find the perfect answer or squeeze some perfect action out of each other, some of the things we're doing are just going more slowly. So on a very practical level, that means our staff isn't working 60 hours a week. We're working 40. It means we're not running a 7-day-a-week campaign mode. We're running 5-day-a-week campaign mode. It means running a series of right-sized experiments right now instead of a full-on statewide enormous effort, trying to figure out like where's the juice, where are some of these experiments getting traction. It's hard out there. I think we're doing it imperfectly, and those are some of the ways that some of that hard-earned lessons in 2014 we're trying to show up with it.
Okay, thank you. So last question for you, Katey. Is there one more insight or gift or antidote to something that's plaguing us in our movements right now that you want to offer us here at the end of this conversation?
I think sometimes when the conditions are hard, we can put a lot of pressure on ourselves to know the exact right thing to do, or put pressure on other people to also be right in the way that they're operating. And I think the truth is, it's so reasonable and maybe even frankly healthy to feel lost or up against it or confused about what we do next. And my wish for us is that instead of railing against that posture or that set of feelings, that we, for those of us that are feeling it, embrace it and relate to it wisely and with care for ourselves. That's my wish.
I can't resist sharing with you all a little of what Katey added 6 months after we spoke. You can read the whole thing from the link in the show notes. She said, "We ran 4 independents and local races this year, with different folks in our leadership having different beliefs about how well they would do. Every one of our independents lost outright. We grieved it, especially in care for the candidates who stuck their necks out there and did a ton of work. But strategically, we could hold it lightly. One of our staff who was especially excited about this strategy said in a meeting when we debriefed, 'Well, now we know, experiment complete.' There's an ease that experimentation invites." I also asked her what else they had done to adapt to so many losses. She said, "One response we could have to the conditions being very difficult is that we could put pressure on ourselves to find the exact right, perfect strategy that will fix everything. We could try to extract from ourselves the right thing to do. I think that's a fool's errand. Not only do I think it's impossible to know what that is, it's also not a posture that invites creativity and growth." We just had a weekend-long movement retreat with 30 leaders across our state and spent much of the second day of that retreat practicing this posture to set us up for our next set of strategy decisions. I asked leaders to get into small groups of 4 and make a sculpture with their bodies that represented being directed by, quote, should. We took a beat and noticed what we saw in the shapes. Folks made all sorts of formations, most of them tight, fearful, straining. I asked the group to make a list of the warning signs that we might be acting out of, quote, should, as we create our next season's strategy. Then I asked folks to adjust their sculptures to being directed by our calling. Same thing. We stepped back to notice them. These sculptures were more joyful, creative, relational. The mood of the room shifted, and it was from there that we started to talk about our dreams for our next season. What could we try? What could we experiment with that would match our callings? Now this is me again. May this be a year that we all practice the posture that makes the most sense for our campaigns, our callings, our dreams of this season or the next one. After all, some seasons are for resting, for letting the ground replenish and be restored. The Craft of Campaigns podcast is a project of the Organizing Skills Institute at Training for Change and made possible by grassroots donors. Visit Training for Change for workshops, training tools, and other resources. We welcome your feedback and nominations for other campaigns that should be featured on this podcast. If you like these episodes, please consider donating to keep the show running. This podcast is produced by Ali Roseberry Polier. I'm Andrew Willis Garces. See you next time.